Good morning, everybody. My name is Coach Spivey. It's good to be back with you. This is the second of 6 lessons that we'll be presenting on 9th grade world history. We'll pick right back up where we left off. If you remember last time, we were looking at the first of 3 critical standards, and that standard is to explain causes and consequences of World War I, including imperialism, militarism, nationalism, and the alliance system. And last week our sole focus was on causes, and we will pick back up. We didn't get quite finished with the causes, but we will pick back up with that and look at World War I itself, some of the stuff that happened during it, and look at the consequences of World War I. So let's dive right back in with a quick review of what we covered last time. Easiest way to remember it, 3, 2, 1 are the causes of World War I. So let's look at what the 3 things are, the 2 things are, and that 1 thing. 3 what? 3 isms. Hopefully you remember that. 3 isms, 2 alliances, and 1 event. We looked solely at the 3 isms last week. Let's do a quick review of what those 3 isms are. They were imperialism. Imperialism, a stronger country taking over, conquering, controlling a weaker nation. And when these European countries engaged in imperialism, it created a lot of competition between them. We looked at how and where that occurred, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia. But we see competition brewing over these colonies. The second ism is nationalism, a pride in, devotion or loyalty to one's nation. That is the people that they belong to. And we start to see pride building and my people are better than your people type idea. And when you combine imperialism with nationalism, again, you're brewing distrust, competition, rivalry, and all of that. And then that third ism was militarism, the building up or glorifying of military. And so if I have all this competition and rivalry brewing, and now people are starting to build up their militaries, it's a recipe for a war. We're going to pick up today on the 2 alliances. So before we look at what the 2 alliances were, let's make sure we understand what an alliance is. An alliance is a union or association formed for mutual benefit, especially between countries or organizations. So in essence, when these alliances began to be built, it was as if, okay, listen, we got some rivalry and competition going on, but if something happens, I need to make sure that somebody's got my back. And so they start to join alliances with one another to make sure that, look, if somebody attacks you, I got your back. And likewise, if somebody attacks me, you got my back. And now not only do we have rivalry and competition, but we got sides beginning to be formed. So let's look at what these 2 alliances were. There were 2 of them. This is a graphic to kind of give you a visual of what it was. On one side, on the left over here in the blue, you have the Triple Alliance, 3 triple obviously. Germany and Austria-Hungary joined together, later joined by Italy, and they formed the Triple Alliance. On the other side, what will become known as the Triple or 3 Entente. Entente is just a French word that means agreement, alliance essentially. First between Russia and France, and then later joined by Britain. So here's your 2 sides, and in the middle right here is the Balkan Peninsula, particularly this country of Serbia. Let me pull this up on a map, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense to you. All right, so if I look on this map, let's kind of identify these 2 alliances. On one side, you had Germany, Austria-Hungary, and then Italy. Italy eventually will actually switch sides once the war starts. But you have them in the middle. And Germany had a great distrust for France. And so they wanted to make sure they had an ally on their side. And France, because of the threat of Germany, they needed to know that they had somebody on their side. So they joined up with Russia. And when Germany started building up their military, one of the things they built up was their navy, which made Britain very nervous. And so Britain joined up with France and Russia. And so what you'll see is when the war starts, this group becomes known as the Central Powers because they're centrally located in Europe. And then on the other side, this group became known as the Allies, and others would eventually join them. So now we've got these two alliances. They're nose to nose. All it'll take is just a little spark to get this whole war started. So let's go back to causes. And we've got the isms, we've got the alliances. Well, what was the event that set it all off? Let me pull this map back up and kind of set the scene for you. So we've got, if you remember, nationalism, or pride in, devotion to one's people. Well, there was a group of people called the Slavic people. And the majority of the people in this little country right here of Serbia were Slavic people. But there was a lot of Slavic people in this little area that had been annexed by Austria-Hungary called Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so part of the nationalistic movement is we want to make sure our people are taken care of, create our own country. And one interesting note is that a lot of the people of Russia were of the Slavic nationality as well. So when Austria-Hungary comes in and takes over this Slavic people, the Slavic people in Serbia, that didn't sit too well with them. And what happened one day was this dude right here, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was actually the prince next in line to take over for Austria-Hungary, comes riding up into Sarajevo, a city in this area. And this dude right here, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. And you can imagine that this was the spark that set World War I in motion. Do you think Austria-Hungary just took it laying down? No, of course not. They're not going to let their kind of next in line to take over be assassinated and nothing happened. So eventually they declare war on Serbia. Well, Russia, seeing themselves as the Slavic protector of Serbia, obviously they had to step in and declare war on Austria-Hungary. Well, if you think of that alliance system, now Germany, because they're in alliance with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia, and because France was Russia's ally, they declared war on France. And because Germany declared war on France, now France declared war on Germany, but they also declared war on Austria-Hungary as well because they're in an alliance. And Britain joins in with France and Russia, and now this is the event that got it all started. So World War I is on. So let's look at World War I. Anytime you see it called the Great War, that's equivalent. World War I, Great War, same thing. Obviously, the people of that time didn't foresee that there may be a second World War, so most of the time during that particular era, they called it the Great War. Most people thought this was going to be a quick war. They marched off to war thinking they're going to be back in no time at all. Wrong. They got bogged down in a war that would last about 4 years. Most people at the time thought this was going to be a war to end all wars. As many countries that were involved, there would never be another one like this. And as you know, of course there was a World War II, but there was subsequent wars after that, so they were wrong on that end. I'll be referring to this map a lot, kind of give you a visual of what was going on during World War I, and we'll take a look at some of the things that happened. first of all, World War I, once it started, Germany had this plan called the Schlieffen Plan. They thought that since France and Russia were allies, it would be hard for Germany to fight on two fronts. I couldn't be fighting somebody this way and then worried about somebody behind me and, oh no, what am I going to do? So this is the plan. If we can hurry up and take out France, then we can turn our full attention back to Russia. And so this was the Schlieffen Plan. Let's attack France real quick and then we'll turn back. Well, they did. Now, France and Germany share a border right there, but instead of going through this fortified area right here, Germany went through Belgium that way. And they ended up making it almost to Paris, which would obviously be the downfall of France. And one of the most important battles of World War I was called the First Battle of the Marne, where the Allied forces actually stopped the German advancement into France. And they got bogged down in what would be a long, bloody fight along the Western Front, as opposed to the Eastern Front, the Western Front of World War I. This Western Front was characterized by trench warfare, which we definitely need to take a look at. So let's look at trench warfare. First of all, you probably know what a trench is, kind of like a little ditch. But let's look at what trench warfare was and kind of what characterized it. On one side in trench warfare, you have one army. Other side, you had another army, and they were both dug out in these trenches in defensive positions. In between was this area called no man's land. And this no man's land could vary from 25 yards to a mile wide, littered with barbed wire and machine gun nests. And the whole idea was, I got to figure out a way to get over here and take this enemy out. So what would end up happening is you would shoot artillery shells across the way, try to soften up the enemy's defensive lines. That's what this is, a little artillery shell. And then eventually when you felt like that they were softened up enough, you'd come over the top into no man's land, try to rush over, and it was just a big bloodbath on each ways, going each way for just a small piece of land. And thousands, in fact, there were some battles where 60,000 people would die in one day. Very, very bloody. Now you can imagine what life in the trenches would look like. It was no joyride either. What if it rained? Well, these trenches would fill up. You got a trench full of mud, and so life in these trenches was characterized by mud, rat infestations. What if somebody died? What are you going to do with the body? A lot of times these trenches were littered with the casualties of war. Let me give you a quote. From somebody who experienced life in the trenches, and hopefully this will give you an idea. It says, imagine a broad belt, 10 miles or so in width, stretching from the Channel to the German frontier near Basel, which is positively littered with the bodies of men and scarified with their rude graves, in which farms, villages, and cottages are shapeless heaps of blackened masonry, in which fields, roads, and trees are pitted and torn and twisted by shells and disfigured by dead horses, cattle, sheep, and goats, scattered in every attitude of repulsive distortion and dismemberment. It was just awful. And the people that actually lived through this were scarred for the rest of their life from the memories and life of trench warfare. Let's look back at this map and talk further. Not only was there the trench warfare on the Western Front, but also the fighting that really got bogged down in the Eastern Front between Germany and Austria-Hungary with Russia. Some of the weapons of World War I that made this particularly brutal, when you go into war with the same old tactics, but this new technology in warfare, it was an equation for lots and lots of death. Here's some of the weapons, some of the new weapons of World War I. Whoops. The machine gun. the machine gun. Oh. Let's see. Well, not working. The machine gun. Let me mention some other ones. Chemical warfare with some of the poisonous gases like chlorine and mustard gas. The tank. The British introduced the tank. The Germans introduced the submarine. There was actually the new invention of the airplane, and so some air power, mostly for reconnaissance, but we also see the Germans' use of the Zeppelin, a big balloon that was, they launched firepower from there. So some of the weapons, some of the weapons of World War I made this particularly brutal. So they were bogged down. Well, what helped turn the tide for the war? Turn the tide of the war? Actually, the U.S. got involved, and as the U.S. entered the war. I'll just go through this. The United States entered the war. It really turned the tide of the war. Let's see if I can do it on here. My little lesson don't want to work right, but that's technology issues. So let's just roll with it. At first, the United States was sending the Allies supplies, and the Germans, because they knew if they wanted to win this war, they were going to have to stop the United States from helping the Allies. What they ended up doing, the Germans, is engaging in what's called unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning they were going to shoot down any ship that entered their waters without warning. And that didn't matter what kind of ship it was. And in fact, they started shooting down passenger ships, and one of the passenger ships they shot down was one called the Lusitania. And the Lusitania, even though it was a passenger ship, was actually smuggling in some weapons. Aboard that passenger ship, there were over 100 U.S. citizens. And when that sunk and the U.S. citizens were killed, it created a movement that many in the United States wanted to go declare war on Germany. And the straw that broke the camel's back was when the British intercepted a letter from the Germans to Mexico, basically forging an alliance with Mexico. If you, Mexico, would attack the United States, we got your back. And so when that letter, called the Zimmerman Telegram, was intercepted, that was the final straw that sent the United States into World War I. Let me mention a couple of side notes before we talk about the United States entering the war. And again, this lesson's not wanting to work. The first little side note is I want you to know that it was in fact a world war. Even though the majority of the war was fought in Europe, it was fought in other places as well. In the Middle East, it was fought, especially where the oil resources were located. If you remember with imperialism, they had overseas colonies. These colonies were fought with one another, and the different nations would try to take out the other's colonies. Another little side note of the war, not only was it a world war, but it was a total war, which means countries dedicated all of their resources toward the war effort. You can imagine, well, like right now, the pandemic we're in, the resources that are being dedicated to fight against this pandemic. Another little side note to mention is in 1918, there was the Spanish Flu Epidemic that broke out. And much like the pandemic we're in now, it caused a lot of death. And in fact, the Spanish flu that broke out in 1918 took more lives than World War I itself. And I wanted to mention that as side notes before we talk about how this war ended. I'm sorry, this is very frustrating, not being able to show you what it is I'm telling you. World War I ended when eventually the Allied forces, backed by this new fresh wave of American soldiers in 1918 began. So when the U.S. entered, kind of got a shot in the arm for the Allies. Most of these European nations were weary of the fighting that was going on, and eventually Russia backed out of the war. And so when Russia backed out, now Germany could turn their full undivided attention towards the Western Front in France, and they gave one last push almost all the way to Paris until at the Second Battle of the Marne, the Allied forces stopped that German advance, pushed them back, and eventually on November the 11th, 1918, the German forces signed an armistice, which is an agreement to stop fighting. And in fact, today, in 2020, we still continue to celebrate a holiday on November the 11th. It's called Veterans Day, where we celebrate those that have fallen, our soldiers. That armistice was signed on the 11th month, 11th day, at the 11th hour. And so if you ever hear of Veterans Day called Armistice Day, now you know why. And now you know also why we celebrate that particular holiday. So that brought an end to World War I. It wasn't necessarily a war over territory, but who could wear the other one down. And because of that, you see some consequences of World War I. Let me mention some of these consequences. I'm going to try one more time. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Some of the consequences of World War I, obviously the tremendous loss of life. About 8.5 million soldiers, were killed during World War I. That's not even counting the citizens and the innocent victims of World War I. Not only was it a tremendous cost of human life, but it was a tremendous cost financially. These European economies were completely in ruin, difficult to be rebuilt. Not only was that a consequence, the human casualties, the financial costs, but there was this disillusionment was set in. This isn't how we thought life would be. And you can see in the 1920s a lot of the art and music that represented this feeling of disillusionment that came after World War I. And finally, one of the things that we'll look at, and we'll look at this more in detail because it's going to have an impact on what the world looked like in between World War I and World War II, was the treaty that was signed called the Treaty of Versailles. And we'll look more in depth next time at that particular consequence of World War I. Let me come back to this as a matter of review. We looked at the causes, right? 3, 2, 1, 3 isms, 2 alliances, 1 event. We looked at World War I itself, the fighting on the Eastern Front, as well as the Western Front, characterized by trench warfare. Looked at some of the new weapons, some of the fighting that was going on. And then we did look at some of the consequences. One of the consequences, and this is where we'll pick up next time, is that Treaty of Versailles, and we'll look at this, what would be a period of, not just in the United States, but a period of the Great Depression that hit the world. And some of that was as a result of what happened during World War I. Sorry for the technical difficulties today. I'll try to work on that. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much.